Hello, and thank you so much for joining me. My name is Sue Sullivan. I work at Perkins School for the Blind. I'm a secondary math teacher, and today I'm here to talk to you about math games as an effective teaching tool within your classroom. So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about who I am as a teacher and a little bit about my classroom. I work in Perkins School, as I mentioned. I teach kids who are ages 14 through 22, and I teach all levels of math. So I could teach anything from basic number sense right up through Algebra 2, depending on what the students need. And although I am a classroom-based teacher, I made this presentation in mind with itinerant teachers in mind, because I know many people who may be watching this are itinerant teachers, and I wanted this to be useful for a lot of different audiences. And so I have a lot of ideas on math games, on why math games are good for your students, and on how you can use them in your classroom. And I'm going to give a lot of examples about math games, and they're going to be really detailed out in a handout that you can get that gives specific directions on how to play and where to find rules for the games and things like that. And this I just wanted to share with you is a picture of my classroom, and it tells a little bit about what kind of teacher I am. I'm a little messy, I'm a little fun. I think that we all need to be really careful about like what our attitude towards math is when we're teaching, and that the more enthusiastic we are about math and the more excited we are, the more we can engage our students and get them excited. And so I try to tell math jokes. I have some things up here for my low vision students, a very large Sudoku puzzle that they can do when they transition in and out, a crossword puzzle that when you flip it upside down, it spells words, the numbers present as words. And I just try to keep my classroom novel and interesting for the students. So in today's presentation, we're going to talk about the benefits of playing games with your students, lots of examples of math games, as I mentioned, and different ideas for games that can be used, modified on the fly, and adapted for different levels, which provide both opportunities for both cooperation and independence. And so I just want to share a little bit about the success I've had in my classroom and the excitement that I have about math. And the first 20 minutes of the presentation will be more about like the benefit of playing games, and then we'll actually get into examples of games. And I wanted to mention that a lot of the games that I've created or play in my classroom are really for foundational math skills, kind of kindergarten through 8th grade. I feel like they work best. And I do a lot of activities with older students also, or more advanced students, but I find that the way that the regular use of math game is more in that K through 8 range. So let's start by talking about what is a game. The way I kind of think of a game is a game needs to have 2 or more players who take turns, each competing to achieve a winning situation of some kind, with an element of chance to level the playing field. And I feel like that element of chance is what makes games really fun, because otherwise your most accomplished student is going to continually to win the game. And so by adding this chance, it kind of levels the playing field. And so things I keep in mind when I'm creating a game is to make games at just the right level. If the math is too hard in a game, it's going to be less appealing for the students to play. There's going to be frustration, and it's not going to feel fun anymore. So a lot of times I use games to review a skill that they need to go back and touch on to support what the new material that they're learning. I make the games enjoyable to play. Games that promote interaction and dialogue. That's really important because a lot of our students, or some of our students I should say, really communication may be their main goal throughout the day, and math may be a way that you're supporting their communication skills. And most of my games are 5 to 10 minutes long. I just really want them to be a part of my lesson. I know that we're all trying to get so much math in, and this is just a way to take a little bit of your time with your students and have some fun. So not all of my games fit all of these criteria, but it's something that I try to keep in mind as I'm creating new games. So just to inspire you on why you should maybe introduce math games into your time with your students, It's a really fun way to develop lots of math skills or to support math skills that students already know, especially number sense and problem solving skills. I feel a lot of the games that you play with students really go back to these two skills. It's a great way to review previously learned skills, things like multiplication facts, division facts, anything to do with fractions. They're things that our students need to review over and over again, and games are a new way of allowing them to review a lesson that they already know or that they need to have a little bit more time with. Let's see. It gives an opportunity to allow students to feel successful because once again, maybe after doing a new lesson that's a little bit more challenging, you can end your math lesson with a game where they're a little bit more successful in the skill. It lowers the stress of students, which is really important in our math classrooms because math can be hard for a lot of students. And by lowering the stress level, it allows their working memory to work better and it allows the learning to happen a lot easier. It makes learning math even more fun, of course. It allows for social interaction and math dialogue. And one thing that's really important in a math classroom is having students talk about math. And games are a way that you can get this authentic math discussion and having them talk about it. And so I think that's a really great benefit of playing games. And finally, with our students, the ECC skills of rec and leisure and self-determination are something that is very important. So just some things to keep in mind. Games are most meaningful when they're attached to a lesson or review or skill. For example, if I'm about to do an order of operation lesson, I may play a game with exponents first in order to help students remember what exponents are and feel comfortable with them before we raise the complexity of using exponents by putting them into an order of operation problem. I keep games really simple and really short. I want my students to be able to learn the game in like less than 1 minute and get down to playing. A game with lots of rules gets complicated and isn't as much fun. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. You can use fewer cards when you play a card game. Maybe hand out 5 cards instead of 8. For example, I think most people are familiar with the game Uno. And if I start playing the game Uno in order to teach what a game is how I would use that game, I would take out the skip cards and the reverse turn cards and the +4 cards and just play with the number cards at the beginning so students can get familiar with how to play a game and the basics of a game without it becoming too complicated. It's good to use repeatable basic game structures so students become familiar with the rules, and what you're doing is you're just changing the content. And I'm going to show examples of this in my presentation. But what it allows is it allows kids to become comfortable with a game, and then you can step back and over time allow them to run their own games, which is a great skill for them to learn. Creating winnable moments keeps the game fun. I always invite students to create their own games or variations of games that we're playing. For instance, we may decide whether the high card wins or the low card wins, or they sometimes ask about, you'll see throughout the presentation, there's a couple different things that my students have requested. And then getting families involved. I hope that by learning how to play card games and other games that when our students are home, they have an opportunity to join in on games that either their siblings are playing or their family is playing. Some other things to keep in mind are that games allow different students at different levels to play the same game. So in a group of students playing a game, one student might be encountering a concept for the first time, another may be developing his or her understanding of the concept, and a third consolidating. So for an example of this would be if there was a multiplication game where one student was fairly confident in their skills, but just maybe working on the trickier ones like the 7s and the 9s tables. And she can play that same game with a student who needs a multiplication chart and who is just learning their multiplication skills, their multiplication facts, and is using the chart to support it. And then the third student could be somebody who's somewhere in the middle, and they can all help support each other while playing the game and play a game together. I find that games give you a chance to do an informal assessment on students. For instance, if I find my students are making some errors with division, I may, at the end of the class, take out some division flashcards and play war with them just to see how they're doing with the division facts. And we've talked about home and school before, but they provide, a hands-on interactive way to be engaged in both school and at home. So I know there's so much math to be teaching our students, and it's hard to take time away from the textbook or the lessons in order to do something fun. And so I want to mention again that really these games that I'm talking about, many of them are 5 to 10 minutes long. It's not a ginormous part of your lesson. And these are just some thoughts to keep in mind at times when maybe you can fit in a quick game. So if you're working one-on-one with a student in a tutoring session, a game is a really fun way to kind of break up the routine and do something different and still be practicing math skills. If the classroom teacher is out and you have a substitute and you need a lesson plan, that's a good time for a game. As a behavior incentive, I had a student who I had last period of the day, most days of the week, and by Friday she was really struggling. And so we set up an agreement that if she stayed on task throughout the week, that the last 15 minutes on Friday we would play a game, and it worked out really well. We got a lot more math in once we had that incentive. I find sometimes students transition in and they need a few minutes to kind of get settled for the day, especially the beginning of the day. And sometimes a quick game might just give students a chance to get ready for their learning. The last 10 minutes of class is a great way to play. I like that a lot because I feel like if you get the lesson done and you have a few minutes to spare, to play a quick round of something really leaves the kids leave feeling very energized about math class. Students having a tough day, sometimes a student walks in and is just not ready to face math. They may literally say to me, I just can't do fractions right now. And so I always ask them, well, what can you do? And I'll start ratcheting it down until I find something that the student feels comfortable. And often a few minutes of playing a low stress math game where they're still doing their math, they then have calmed down and are ready to start doing the lesson. If you have a larger group, you can take a few kids to the side and play a game. And this is a great way to integrate our students with some peers and have them play games together. I always find that day before vacation week or towards the end of the school year when things are winding down, that it gets trickier to do traditional lessons, and something like a Jeopardy game or another similar type game is a way that we can still get math into the students, but in a much more fun way. The last class of the day, our students at Perkins go to school from 8 until 4, and a lot of them have long commutes. So towards the end of the day, if they have class one day a week with me for math, that might be a day where I work in more games just because I can tell the students are fatigued. And then we do teach summer school at Perkins, or if you have indoor recess in your school, those are times where maybe you have an opportunity to have a little bit more fun. So we're getting to the end of my presentation before we get into the games. But just some things about math games in particular. They give students an opportunity to explore fundamental number concepts such as counting, sequence, one-to-one correspondence, and computation strategies. And I feel like a lot of card games kind of hit on all of those points. And then also engaging mathematical games can also encourage students to explore number combinations, place values, patterns, and other important mathematical concepts. So all of these activities and games that I'm doing with the students really are very rich in math and in math learning. So just some things I wanted to mention that work for me when I've been developing games and what doesn't. You're going to create your own list and decide what kinds of things you like doing with your students and what doesn't work. But for me, I find that anytime I call anything a game, the students are very excited, and it always strikes me as kind of funny when I ask them if they want to play War with division fact cards, and they get really excited. And it's a way that I'm getting them to practice their division flashcards, but instead of having them flip through them monotonously, like this adds an element of fun to it. I find that 3 to 4 students is the maximum amount that you want to play a game with, because otherwise it just takes too long and the students start to lose interest. As I've mentioned before, I keep the games very simple and very short. and just the right level of math, but I also make my games really full of math. And a lot of ways we do this is if it's a turn taking, I sit and think, do I really need to wait for every student to take their turn independently, or can they all take their turn together? So for instance, they can all kind of solve their math fact together and then see who has the highest. Or if it's a Jeopardy game where it's a quiz show format, I'll have them all solve every single problem, not just the problem that they pick. So you have to be a little creative on how you can get the most math in as possible. Things that don't work for me are games based on speed. I really feel like our students have all different levels of learning, and I wouldn't want the fastest student to be winning. Games with brand new math or math that is too challenging isn't a great format because you're adding the social complexity in, and it's not as much fun if the students have to work really hard at the math. The math where it's reinforcing skills tends to make the games more fun. And then I avoid games where pieces travel around a board because I feel like they're laborious, they are slow, and for me, that's something I don't enjoy, but once again, you get to choose what works best for you. So these are some math games that I have in my classroom, and I just took a quick picture of one of my shelves one day, and I thought I would introduce them to you. And once again, these are all listed in the handout, so you don't have to worry about tracking it as we go. But I took Monopoly Junior. I found Monopoly was a very complex game, and so I took Monopoly Junior that I had, and I made it all tactile with tactile tape and Braille. And so that's a game that it's not one of my favorite things to play, but during the summer once in a while, it has a lot of good number sense and money management in it. Guess Who is a game that I took the faces out. You may be familiar with it. I took the faces out and put numbers in, and the students basically have to guess what their opponent's number is by asking questions like, is it odd? Is it even? Is it divisible by 3? You can make up the rules depending on the complexity that you want to have it. Countdown is a board game that I had in my house because I have some kids at home, and all I had to do was add Braille labels to it, and it was ready to play with my students. And you roll two dice, and you add, subtract, multiply, or divide them, and you're trying to get all the numbers 0 through 9. Racco's a really fun game that I'm going to talk about later that I think has great number sense in it. This game, 24, is a game where you're given 4 numbers, and you have to add, subtract, multiply, and divide them to get the number 24. And what I love about this game is there's often, almost always, more than one way to get the number 24 with these 4 numbers. So it really reinforces how math is so beautiful, and there's so many different ways you can combine numbers. And it's really good practice with facts in a fun way. 99 is a game that's made by the company Farkle, and you basically keep putting cards down, adding up to racing to the number 99. So you're adding, you'll be 4 and then 8, 6, you just keep adding as you go. So what I like about it is you'll be at like the number 34, and somebody will play the number 7 and have to do 34 plus 7 is 41. And so it's a good way to practice math facts at a higher level. And then Moby is a game that is like bananagrams, but with numbers and operations. I think pretty much addition and subtraction, but now I can't remember. So a few of my things that I use all the time to create my games and that I find are really a super big help are some tools from APH. One of them is these Braille number labels. So I can peel them off and stick them on cards and things, and they're automatically ready to be used by both my low vision students and my Braille students. And I find that I use these all of the time. They're so great to have. The graphic tape you can lay down. If you put 2 layers of it, it becomes very tactile for students. So things like outlining a Monopoly board or a bingo table, like a bingo board, I use the graphic tape for. Fabric paint is another thing that makes things very, very tactile. That's something that I use a lot. Fun tack is the material that you use to hang posters on a wall if you don't want to use a thumbtack, and that's something I use in my classroom in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to show examples of these. And then finally, this Brailleable Label and Sheets by APH. What it is it's paper that feeds into the embosser. You can see the holes on the side, and I can put anything into Duxbury, translate it, and then print it onto these Brailleable labels and sheets. And now I have my Braille on sticky paper that I can cut and peel to label my games. So for instance, I printed off a whole set of division fact cards, flashcards. I put the equations into Duxbury and translated them, printed them, and then I cut out, 12 divided by 4 and 15 divided by 3 in Braille and labeled all of my flashcards. So now we're getting to the fun part where we're going to talk about games. And as I said, I kind of kept itinerant teachers in mind because I know that there's so many of them out there. And so what I did is I thought if you created a math game kit, if you had 6 die, a set of cards, and a set of Jeopardy, like homemade Jeopardy cards, then I made a whole group of games that you could play with just having this kind of in your kit or in your bag. And so we're going to talk about each of these one at a time. So to start with cards, I have all different sets of cards in my classroom. I have big ones, and I have, with color. I also have, APH also makes a card holder, which some students like to hold. And you can order these on Amazon.com. Or the other thing you can do is I found that casinos give away large print cards for free. So if you call a casino and ask, you can get cards for free. You will have to Braille them yourself, of course. And some of these you might be able to see that I stuck those APH Braille labels on, and some of them I've had Braille. But in the middle also I have cards that I created myself. And what I did is I took an index card, I printed off the numbers 0 through 9, cut them out, I pasted them on the index card, laminated them, and then put that APH sticker, the Braille sticker on it, so they're for my Braille students too, and clip the edge. And really, it sounds like a lot of effort, but these cards have been such a great tool for me in my classroom because they're so good for students with CVI because the numbers are big and bold. And also I found a lot of times when I'm playing with my students, the numbers, it's visually too confusing to have the cards. And I'm going to show an example of this. This is a game that I play with my students, and it's in order for them to learn how to read really large numbers. So I took a piece of paper and I cut it in half. I used that APH tactile tape for the dashes at the bottom of where to place the cards, and a Braille comma. I stuck a comma down for the comma in Braille. And what we do is we deal out these cards one at a time, and the students build their numbers. And we play different ways, and this is one of the examples where I let the students choose. Sometimes we start on the right-hand side and build the number larger and larger. So we'd put down the 0, then we'd read 20, then 620 as each round goes. And who has the largest number, we're always talking. Now you can see the benefit of using my cards over using a standard deck of cards. The standard deck of cards is visually confusing. The ace is a 1, which we keep having to repeat. The students are reading 3 of spades, ace, 8 AS, 6 H, and I felt I kept having to remind them to not pay attention to the suit. The other thing is my cards have the number 0 in it, and that was a really big reason that I created my own cards, because 0 is an important number to use. And one of the ways that I have used this to become more, use the same game structure but made it more complex is I start with a regular deck of cards, but once my students can read these numbers fairly easy, I load it with zeros. So I take all the zeros and a handful of other cards, and we're playing where zeros are appearing all the time, because reading the number 30,020 is tricky for students. And so it's a way to reinforce a slightly more complex skill. And it's funny. Every time they flip a 0, they think it's really funny. So I've had a lot of great success with this. And And then another thing I did to change the game up is I added decimal. I changed it to have a decimal point. Like when the students had kind of accomplished reading numbers and then accomplished reading numbers with zeros, I added reading numbers with decimal points in it. And so I started with tenths and then moved to hundredths. And so that's a way that you can take the same game and change the content of it. So you're keeping the students learning new math. After a while, I felt they weren't learning new math by playing that basic formation, but now reading hundredths is a new skill. Oh, this slide got a little bit messed up. I apologize. It must have been when I downloaded it. But let me explain it to you. So I joked like it's so complicated to make one slide about cards because there's so many great card games that you can play with students. I even found on Pi Day a really fun Pi game card game that you can play. But generally, some games that I play in elementary school are War. It's a very basic way of comparing numbers, right? Go Fish, which takes a tremendous amount of communication skills, and that is a great game to play with a student who needs to work on their communication. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. Top It is a game where you put down two cards and add them together or subtract them or multiply them or whatever you want and compare who has the highest number. That place value game I just showed you is a game that I like to play with kind of an elementary school math level. And then Uno and Crazy Eights are two games which I don't really love to play in a math classroom because I don't feel like there's any math in it. But the way that I use those is to help students understand what a game is and how to take turns without a lot of complexity. Especially Crazy Eights is a great game to play to help introduce students to what a deck of cards is, because some of our students I found didn't know what a deck of cards is. So that's a way to introduce the numbers and the suits and what they mean. And to reduce the complexity, you can play open-handed with cards. You can reduce the number of cards you're playing in the round. That the students are holding in their hands, or you can use like a slant board to hold the cards up. There's different ways that you can help your students. Some middle school games that I play are Integer War, and that's where the red card maybe is positive and the black card is negative, and you flip two over and you have to add them together. And that's a skill, adding integers is a skill that students need to do for a long time in a lot of different ways, and this is just one of the ways that I would help reinforce that skill. Skip-Bo is a game that a student brought in for home and asked to play, so we played that one day. And the 99 game I showed you earlier, it's a game by Farkle. And then at the high school level, there's a couple of games that I find that have worked really well, and one of them is Blackjack, and that's the game 21, where students are adding up numbers to get to 21. And I think it teaches such incredibly great math skills because they're adding up numbers, but at the same time subtracting how far they are from 21. And the other thing I've noticed is I play this with my students who are older because they're still in high school at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and it's a way to help them feel adult-like, where they know it's a game that's played at casinos, they know it's a game that maybe their family has played, their parents, and so it teaches them what a deck of cards is, it gives them a social event, and it's doing math at the same time. So I actually have an after-school group that I play Blackjack with, and I encourage our students to play it back in the cottage too. Rummy 500 is a game that I played with that student on Friday afternoons when she needed a boost. And Cribbage is a game which I have not been able to integrate into my classroom, but I know it has such great math in it. And if you ever had like an after-school group or a way that you could integrate it, it's a good class. It's a good game. So this is a screen. I wanted to play Go Fish with some nonverbal students that I had, and so two different speech pathologists created this screen on my student's communication device so that we could play Go Fish together. And so this was a student whose really her main her main reason for being at school was really to learn how to communicate. And secondary, I felt, was the math. And so this was a way that we could incorporate a communication device and be social and still be doing number recognition with her. And it's just something to keep in mind that if you have students that you might want to play a game with, is how can you include them and what can you do to make it to allow everybody to play. So these are some other ways that I've used my cards that I created. Up in the left-hand corner, you'll see that there's a complicated board game type of thing that I got off of Teachers Pay Teachers, but I loved the actual game of, it was a different way to practice division facts. And so instead of moving a piece around that board, that would have taken me, couldn't think of even how I would have made that accessible to my students, but I wanted to play the game. And so I had them pick a division flashcard instead and used my numbers and my number cards in the middle. Instead of coloring in a number, they just picked up my number card. And you can look this game up on Teachers Pay Teachers, but the thing I wanted to get across to you was I had my division cards made and I had my number cards made, and so I pulled this together in 30 seconds to play with my students. So once you start building your materials, you'll find more and more ways to use them. This 99 or bust card, the cards that came in the package, that they were fairly accessible, and some of my low vision students could have probably used them. But all I had to do was create a couple of cards that said 99 and a couple of cards that said -10, and then I could use my cards to play this game. Everything was already brailled, and it's not having any visual fatigue for our students. I created this negative, positive, and equals sign to set up equations like in front of students for fun. And then this last idea over on the side is a puzzle sheet that I inherited from a friend. And what it is it has a couple of different questions to answer that are fun. And you use the numbers 0 through 9 to answer these questions. And the reason I put this on is because I could give the students this sheet and a pen and have them sit down and do it. But by giving them the cards, it feels more like a game and feels less like a worksheet. And so think about how you could use different manipulatives and cards and things to instead of just using a pen and paper. Okay, so that was a little bit about cards, and like I said, all of those rules and things are on your handout. And now I want to talk about dice a little bit. And I've accumulated this huge collection of dice in my classroom because I feel like what works best for the student's vision or what they feel most comfortable with is what they should use. And so they have a lot of different options. And at the top, you'll see dice that I actually created out of paper, and they last forever. My students use them all the time, and I find the numbers they're really big. It's a little bit hard to tell on this picture, but it works really well with my students. And so I think one of the links that I have in the handout is how to make your own die, and it's something to keep in mind. And then you can make die with bigger numbers also, which is nice. So we're going to talk a little about games that I play with dice. Also, I find the big dice the larger dice are really great for students who have fine motor difficulties, because now you've taken out the challenge of trying to pick up little dice and roll little dice. So some of the games that I play with dice is you can take a lot of the card games you play and actually use dice instead, and that is, it just mixes it up a little bit and makes the game feel a little bit more fun. The top picture with the numbers 1 through 6, that's actually my version of a Yahtzee game. I just took the numbers, I made my own board up, and if you look up the games, there's no reason to actually buy the game Yahtzee. You can just look up the rules and kind of play a very basic game of that. And basically you roll 6 dice and you kind of accumulate how many ones can you accumulate, how many twos. And so there's a lot of adding in it. And it's a fun way to practice some basic math skills. Farkle is a little bit more complicated, and you play to the number 1,000, so the numbers are bigger. And I feel like once kids have kind of mastered Yahtzee, I will then move them on to Farkle. And these are games that take a little bit longer to play. And so what I may do is say, oh, we're going to play 2 rounds of the game today, and we'll just go around twice and then put it away for another day. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Pig is also a game which I enjoy playing. It's a probability game where you roll 6, I think you roll 6 dice. And when you roll a 6, you lose your turn. Oh, no, it's not 6 dice. It's fewer dice, but it's in my handout. You roll the dice, and when you get a 6, your turn is over. And if you roll double 6s, you lose all your points. So it's a way of adding numbers together and also practicing the concept of probability. And then this picture at the bottom I wanted to show you is a way that I have found to practice exponents. And so it's another one of these skills that our students need to really practice a lot, because in print it's easy for a student to do 2 times 3. And I found by using dice and cards that it helped them realize that they're 2 separate numbers that you're doing 2 separate things with. So for instance, 2 to the 3rd power is 2 times 2 times 2. And so one day I told my student, you're going to flip the card, and that's the base number. I'm going to roll the die. That's the exponent, and we're going to do 10. And it was so much better than her doing a worksheet. She only had to look at one problem at a time, so it wasn't overwhelming. Visually, it was much better for her than any worksheet because these cards are fairly big. You can see that the number is about the size of half of an index card. They're large. And it made it more silly, because if you flip a 1 or a 0, or if you roll a 1, really there's no math to be done. So there's always that element of kind of getting out of a math problem. And then I was interacting with her because I was rolling one of them or flipping one of the cards or something. It was a chance for us to keep engaged, because being engaged with your students and getting to know them is really important in a kid's education. They find that when students are connected to their teachers, they do much better in school. So games are also a way to really to connect with your students. So those are some ideas about dice. And the final thing kind of in your kit is a game about Jeopardy games. And I wanted to talk about this in a couple of different ways. I have this fancy board up on the screen right now, and in the beginning of wanting to play Jeopardy, I would always put this game board together, but I soon found that students really didn't care about the game board, and so just having the stack of cards in front of me and passing them out to the students worked equally as well, and it was a huge time saver for me. And at first, when I first started teaching, I thought that the game Jeopardy sounded so complex to kind of create a game of Jeopardy, but when you stop and think about it, all it really is 5 questions, or you could even do 4 or 3, whatever you want, with increasing complexity for each question. And you can see in this slide, I showed a little bit about how you could make a fractions section on Jeopardy get harder. And by making your own Jeopardy, you can really tailor it to what the students are capable of doing. And what I love about this kind of game is that the students get a lot of self-determination. And it's something I try to work. I haven't talked about it much, but it's something I try to work into these games as much as possible. I allow students to pick a game. If I give them a choice of 3 different ones, I allow students to make up the rules a little bit. And in Jeopardy, they can pick what category they're interested in working on and how hard a question they want. So if they feel like an easy question, they can take a 100-point question. If they want to go for the points and try a harder one, they can do a 500-point question. You can do this, you can set this up however you want, but if you scratch down 4 categories and make 3 questions each, you can make a Jeopardy game in 10 minutes and be ready to play. And also, a thing that I really like about Jeopardy is this is a longer game. This takes a longer part of a class to play. Usually I use it as a whole class lesson. It is a great thing to do, like I said, before a holiday, at the end of the school year, on days where you feel like the students are not going to be able to settle down and maybe do a traditional math lesson. I also find that so often I am teaching one skill at a time, right? You tend, like right now in one of my classes, we're working on, let's see, we're working on decimals. And so we'll talk a lot about decimals and adding decimals and things. And when you play a Jeopardy game, you are encouraging students to switch from one thing to another. So for instance, a measurement question, a decimal question, a fraction question, and maybe a integer question. And they're switching topics, which is really important because that's what they're doing on standardized exams. And also it's a different complexity of thinking when you keep needing to switch from one math area to another. So it's a lot of fun. The kids love them. At the end, they add up their points. And I always feel like it's kind of a break in routine. So I encourage you to give it a try. And these are some other ideas that I have. Which One Doesn't Belong is a great website. If you take a few minutes to look at these numbers, 9, 16, 25, and 43, you can kind of think about like, which one doesn't belong? And the thing that's great about this is it's one of these growth mindset tools where there's no wrong answer and there's lots of different right answers. And those are the kinds of math things that I think really engage students and make them interested. So I was walking down the hall one day with 7th graders, and I threw out these numbers because we were walking from one place to another. And I said, you know, which one doesn't belong? And the one that the kids usually start with is, oh, 9 is a single digit and the rest of them are double digits, which is great. And interestingly enough, you know, they had a couple of different responses, but then one of my students said to me, well, 9 plus 16 equals 25. So 43 is the one that doesn't belong. And I thought that was really interesting because it is something that I had not seen right initially. So there's a whole website of them. They're all free. And so I encourage you to check it out and see what works for your students. There's things way beyond numbers into all sorts of different activities. Along the same lines, there's this game called 24 Game. I spoke about it earlier, where the students are adding numbers together to make the number 24, add, subtract, multiply, or divide. So for instance, with this one, let's see, you can do 4 times 2 is 8, times 3 is 24, divided by 1. Or you could do, let's see, what else could we do? We could do 2 times 3 is 6, times 4 is 24, times 1. And there's even more options that you can do. But I think these open-ended math questions that I'm showing you, students are manipulating numbers and working with numbers in a different way, and it's fun for them. And I find that my students really enjoy these kinds of math activities. And again, doing these they don't take very long to do. You can spend, you know, as little as 5 minutes playing a couple of these, but mixing them in kind of keeps math engaging and fun, I find. And finally, you may have heard of some of these, but this is the 4 is 4s challenge. And what it is you can take any 4, if you have the number 4 times, you can create any number, I think from 1 to 100 and beyond. And so I tried this one day with my students and they absolutely loved it. And look at all of the different ways. This is my actual students' answers, all the different ways they found for coming up with the number 1 and all the ways for 2 and so forth and so on. And it's a little bit of a complex slide to read, but I just wanted to show, again, this is students manipulating numbers in many different ways in their heads. And they found it really entertaining. Another thing is one of my students asked me, well, can we use 4 to the 0 power? And again, it was him showing self-determination. I said, absolutely. And what that did is that also lowered the complexity of this task because 4 to the 0 power, as you know, is 1. And so now we have the number 1 we could work with when trying to create all of our numbers. And so it's open, it's engaging. You can have it on your board and have students add to it over time. You could just do it for 5 minutes, you know, here and there, whatever really works for you. So I encourage you to check out some of those kind of open-ended math things, and you don't even need to really you know, if you're traveling an itinerant teacher, if you have a couple of pieces of paper with the directions on them, you're all set to go. And these are some other games that I just wanted to kind of give you some ideas of other things that you can do in your classrooms. I play bingo games, bingo type games. I think this one is you roll a die and double it, and 2 different people play against each other. So I created magnets that were round and ones with Legos on them, so they were tactilely different. And I play these games on a cookie sheet so that things don't keep sliding off. And as you can see, once again, I use the tactile tape to make the borders, and I use the Braille labels from APH to put the Braille numbers on. This other game is with the hundreds board called Factors and Multiples, and it's really great. This is one that I would use like in an algebra classroom, and it is a little bit of a longer game, but has so much great math in it. I start by picking a number, say the number 20, and the next person has to pick a number that is a factor or a multiple of 20. And so they could pick the number 40, 60, 80, or 100 for multiples, or they could pick, 1, 2, 5, 4, 5, 10, 2, any of the numbers that make up 20. And my students started calling this number chess because there's a lot of strategy in it. And what you want to do is, the way I play it is I want to see how many cards we can get off the board before we get stuck, because eventually you run out of factors and multiples. And so that is a great way, because factors and multiples are so important when you're factoring equations and factoring quadratic equations. So that's a skill that you could do. That's a game you could play going into factoring. And then finally, you can create a tic-tac-toe board and put different equations in it and have students solve it to try to create tic-tac-toe equations, tic-tac-toe solutions. So they're just some other ideas for you. And finally, I'm going to end with something that was kind of interesting. Is I picked this game Racco, and I wanted to show you like how I adapted it over time to make it work in my classroom. Because when I first played this game, there was a lot of challenges with it, and instead of saying, "Oh, this isn't a great game," and putting it away, I kept adapting it until it worked for my students. And this is a really big hit with a lot of different students at a lot of different levels. And what you do is you're handed a set of cards, and you put them into your holder in the order you get them. So they start out mixed up, and you pick a card one at a time and replace your cards until they're in order from smallest to greatest. So when I started this, I took all the cards, I took the time to braille them all, and what I found was my low vision students, first of all, could not read the cards at all. And the braille students were having a really hard time reading the cards standing up in this holder, and also having a really hard time putting the cards in the holder. So I felt like there was some frustration in fine motor skills and in reading it, and it was taking away from the game being fun. So what I did is I decided to take my fun tack that I told you about that sticks things to walls, and I fun tacked them on this APH whiteboard that I use for absolutely everything, by the way. And so what I would do is you can see I reduced the number of cards students were playing with to make it easier. I also started by playing with the numbers 0 through 30 instead of 0 through 60, so that my students could learn how to play the game, and then I slowly would add more numbers in until we were playing with the full deck of 0 through 60. 5 cards takes about 3 minutes to play, maybe 5 minutes to play. You could play with 6 or 7 cards. That's more of a 10-minute game, depending on how much time you want to play this game. So what I did for the second round was that I decided that I would put them on the board and I would write the numbers in large print above the cards. But what they did is, first of all, when my students pick a card, they couldn't read it until I told them what it was if they were low vision, and then I was writing the numbers above each card. And I felt like I was too involved in the game and that my students didn't have the opportunity to be independent. So I decided to make my own cards. So now, see, you don't even need to buy the game. I just made the cards 1 through 60, and I had the students fun tacking them on the board, and they're all brailled with those APH braille numbers that I keep talking about. So now my braille students, my low vision students, could read the cards easily. They could, and they were independent in playing. So I felt like this is a really great improvement. But I was noticing that the fun tack was kind of getting to be laborious again, like that they would take the card off, whereas the fun tack, did it stay on the board, did it stay on the card, and it was just taking away from the game. So I decided to play open-handed, and really it works out fine because everybody is so concerned with their own hand, nobody's really looking at someone else's hand. And now the game plays much faster and everyone is independent. So again, this is a game, I feel like it teaches really great number sense, but as my students played it more and more, I felt like they had mastered it. So the next thing I did was I created a new version of Racco and I added decimal numbers in. And so now my students are playing where they're organizing cards with decimal numbers on it. And I've done this also, I recently made negative integers, so students could play with some negative integers and some positive integers, or only with negative integers. And I also created a set of cards with fractions and decimals on it mixed together so that the students would have to organize what's bigger, 33 hundredths or 1/2. And that is, let me tell you, that is challenging. So when I take one of these new sets out, when I first started this with my students, I started the decimal game of Racco and realized that it was way too complex for them. So I cleaned up the game and I tried a second version with these cards. And I honestly don't remember what that was. But then that was even still too complex. So I collected the cards again. And what I did was I gave the students 2 cards and told them which one's larger. And had them put, the larger one on the left and the smaller one on the left and the larger one on the right. And then I handed a third card and said, where does that fit? Then I cleaned up the cards and I started again with just 2 cards and handing them a third card. And slowly but surely, as they got the hang of it, we got closer to playing Racco with a full 5 cards and them organizing it. So I just showed this to you to say that if a game doesn't work, like to try, how can you modify it to make it more successful for your students? And then if a game is working really well and they've conquered the math concepts, like what can you change to keep them challenged and learning? So that was just something I wanted to share with you. And so just to sum up, I have this quote, great education is a combination of a supporting environment, dedicated teachers, and students who take joy in learning. And so I hope that you have found a few things in this presentation to be helpful for you and that hopefully you will try some new activities with your students. Thank you so much for listening.